Book of Daniel, chapter 2 is where we're going to be spending some time tonight. So I'd invite you to get out a Bible and be turning there, Daniel chapter 2. So we pick back up in this series about being in the world but not of the world, which is something that certainly describes the lives of the two figures we've been talking about, Joseph in Egypt, Daniel in Babylon. And I'm looking forward to getting a little further into Daniel's story tonight. Here's a saying you may have heard. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. Have you heard that one before? Heavy is the head that wears the crown. It goes all the way back to Shakespeare, so maybe it's a little archaic at this point. But it's talking, of course, about the strain and stress that comes with being the person who is in charge of it all. So that's where you get the phrase, heavy is the head that wears the crown. A lot of strain and stress when you're that person. And maybe that's why, I kind of found this interesting, maybe that's why some of our presidents throughout history have had a very interesting relationship with sleep. I was reading about this. I know that our presidents don't wear a crown on their head, but they are the person in charge. And for some of them, they were very fickle sleepers. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was basically an insomniac, based on what historians have said. He could hardly sleep at all, day or night. And when you think about what was going on in the world at the time that he was elected president, that probably makes a lot of sense. With the war going on, the Civil War, and everything that was happening, he was sort of the epitome of heavy is the head that wears the crown. Lots of stress, lots of strain in his life. Another president, William Taft, was so fickle in his sleep that he had them construct this sleeping porch on the roof of the White House. That's what you're looking at here, is the roof of the White House. I bet you didn't know that any of our presidents slept on the roof of the White House. But William Taft slept up there. He said that the sounds of the nature soothed him when he was worried about things. And also the breeze was not a bad thing either. It would be another 20 years before the White House had air conditioning. So going up on the roof was kind of nice for William Taft. Others of our presidents have been religious nap takers. One of our presidents was a notorious snorer. That was Teddy Roosevelt. And then probably the exception to this whole thing we've been talking about, from what I read, was Calvin Coolidge. Reportedly, this president was very rigid about getting 11 hours of sleep every single night. And when people would ask him about this, he would tell them, I can't mess anything up if I'm asleep. Seems like a pretty good answer. So needless to say, many of our presidents would probably be very envious of Calvin Coolidge and his ability to sleep with all the things that were going on and all the responsibilities that they had. Well, today our story in Daniel is going to begin with someone who probably knew what Shakespeare was talking about and probably could relate with Abraham Lincoln. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, we meet for the first time King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon during the time of the book of Daniel. And this is what we learn about him the very first time that we meet him. It says, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. And actually, if you've spent much time with the Old Testament, you might know that this is kind of a common experience for some of the kings that we meet in the Old Testament, to have trouble sleeping. Xerxes in the book of Esther has trouble sleeping at night, and that's when he learns about what Mordecai had done to save his life. King Darius, just a few chapters later in the book of Daniel, is going to have trouble sleeping at night, and he's going to be reading through the laws and thinking about Daniel stuck in the lion's den. The book of Genesis, just this last Wednesday, who do we talk about but King Pharaoh? King Pharaoh was having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning at night as he had those dreams that Joseph went on to interpret. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar has here too. It's actually what sets up maybe one of the most well-known common similarities between Joseph and Daniel. Joseph and Daniel, as they live in this faraway place that they found themselves in, both of them are interpreters of dreams. They both hear the dreams of the king, And we saw last week that Joseph's whole life sort of turns around on this point where he interprets the dreams for Pharaoh. Tonight we're going to see what happens with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and his dreams. So in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled. He couldn't sleep. You have to wonder if some of the pressures of his role might have played a role in this. At this time, the Babylonians are in this fierce battle in Syria. Many of their folks are off at war. And also, it's the second year of his reign. He's just establishing himself. Someone I was reading this week pointed out, Ecclesiastes says, a dream comes when there are many cares. Maybe in our own lives we've experienced that before too. But whatever role these stresses and strains may have played in Nebuchadnezzar's life, what we're about to find is that something else is at work in him when he has this dream. God is at work. This God that he knows very little of, but ought to respect and fear very much, is at work in Nebuchadnezzar's life. So he has this dream and he's very troubled. And so Nebuchadnezzar does what he knows to do. And he summoned together the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and the astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. And when they all came in, they stood before the king, and he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. And it kind of strikes me, having just covered Joseph last week and thinking about the way that Joseph handled these sorts of things, it kind of strikes me how self-confident and self-assured these so-called wise men of Babylon are about this dream. They say, you tell us the dream, we will tell you what it means. Isn't that a little different than what Joseph did last time? We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Actually, I'll show you this now. Do you remember Joseph consistently said when people asked him about dreams, the cupbearer, the baker, Pharaoh himself, he was constantly pointing back to the source of wisdom. He said, do not interpretations belong to God? It's not I who interpret these dreams. I can't do it, is the first thing that Joseph said to Pharaoh when Pharaoh asked him to interpret his dream. I cannot do that. But God will give Pharaoh the answer. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. The matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So this is sort of the consistent manner that Joseph had when he approached these dreams. And yet here we have these wise men of Babylon. And eventually they'll get around to talking about their gods, but we'll just have to wait and see when that is. For now, they're saying, you tell us, we'll take care of this for you. They're pretty confident. Right up until King Nebuchadnezzar says this next thing. This sort of sets them back on their heels. King Nebuchadnezzar says to that, this is what I've decided. I don't want you to just tell me what my dream means. I want you to tell me what my dream was before I tell you what it was. And if you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, then I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Spoken like someone who really needs some sleep. But he's pretty upset here. And he lays out this ultimatum and says, I want you to tell me what my dream was, not just what it means. And if you can do that, verse 6, if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. And what do you think these wise men of Babylon say to that? Well, they hem and haw a little bit and drag their feet, and they try to stall for time. And basically what they say is, you can't expect us to do that. It's totally unreasonable. We're not able to do that. Verse 10, there's no one on the earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. They're not talking. So there they are, saying, we don't know what we can do for you. Nebuchadnezzar's not going to have that. He gets so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. And it's here, we're 12 verses into this chapter now, it's here that we finally figure out what any of this has to do with Daniel. What we find in verse 13 is that when he issues this decree to go and execute all of the wise men of Babylon, Daniel is counted among them. You may remember from chapter 1 that Daniel was being trained along with his friends Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were being trained up for the king's service. Well, when they send out this decree, men were sent to go and look for Daniel. And they were looking for him so that they could put him to death, even though apparently Daniel doesn't seem to have been there at all when the king summoned the people in to try and interpret this dream. It's not exactly clear why he wasn't there among them. One possibility is that maybe this is still during his training period. Chapter 1 said that he was going to be trained for 3 years for the king's service. Remember what year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign this is? This is the second year of his reign. Maybe for some other reason, they kind of look at him as less capable, not invited to the table, maybe because of his belief in his God. But for whatever reason, Daniel and his friends don't appear to have been there when the king asks for their guidance. But they're about to face the punishment. So, verse 14, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact, and he asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. This is what makes you think he wasn't there. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. It strikes me that this would have been a moment of great fear and trembling. To approach the king and ask for the very thing that he's not granted to the other wise men. He asks for time. And it also strikes me that Daniel does not yet know the answer. He doesn't know yet what the dream was. What a moment this must be for him. What a heavy head he must have. The stress and strain. He's on a deadline. But he does know where to turn. Then Daniel returned to his house and he explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. Hold on to this next verse for later. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You've given me wisdom and power. You've made known to me what we asked of you. You've made known to us the dream of the king. And so just like what we saw with with Joseph last week, here we have Daniel also, seeking the source of wisdom where it can truly be found. Daniel knows where truth can be found. It can be found in the Lord. And the first thing he does when he finds himself in this predicament, in this dark place, is he seeks the Lord. He seeks the one from whom wisdom and power are all his. And when Daniel finds himself in this dark place, he goes to the one who knows what lies in darkness, and in whom is light, dwelling in him. He prays to the Lord. God hears his prayer. And just like what we saw with Joseph last week, Daniel, when he learns the meaning of this dream, Daniel's going to distinguish himself from everybody else, especially those other wise men of Babylon, through his humility. Remember how Joseph kept saying, God is providing this answer. To God be the glory. Well, watch in these next few verses as Daniel takes no credit for himself, goes out of his way to stick up for the people who left him out, and constantly gives all the credit to God. Verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon. And the first thing Daniel says is, don't do that. Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. And Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I found a man among the exiles from Judah who could tell the king what his dream means. And the king asked Daniel, remember his other name in Babylon was Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? And it's going to bring flashbacks to Joseph. Because the first thing that he says is, in a way, no. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Verse 30, as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. You hear a lot of Joseph in that, don't you? There is a God in heaven who knows these things. And I'm not greater than anyone else, but the God who is God in heaven is going to make this known to you. And then Daniel tells him his dream. It was a dream about this enormous statue. And King Nebuchadnezzar is looking at it. It has a head of gold and a torso of silver and legs of bronze and feet partly of iron, partly of clay. And the king is looking at this enormous, majestic statue when all of a sudden this rock is cut out, but not by human hands. And it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were all broken into pieces. And they became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer, and the wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And then Daniel goes on to explain this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar said, tell me the dream first. Well, here's the dream. And now he's got to interpret it for him. He goes on to explain to Nebuchadnezzar how he himself is represented by that head of gold atop this great, enormous statue, and how the kingdom that will come after him is that torso of silver, and then the kingdom that will come after that is this, legs of bronze, and then there's another kingdom coming after that, which will be both incredibly strong, but also divided and brittle. And that kingdom is like the feet with the iron and the clay. And many people commonly equate these kingdoms with Babylon and then Persia and then Greece and then Rome, the kingdom at the time when Christ was born. So we have the parts of the statue. And then there's this other thing, this rock that breaks the statue and becomes a mountain. And what is that? Verse 44. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. And this is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. This dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. And this is what Daniel says when he stands before King Nebuchadnezzar to explain his dream to him. Now, I know that this is a rather lengthy chapter, and we've spent a lot of our time really making our way through the story itself, but now that we're kind of nearing the end of the chapter, it strikes me that there's just so much that can be said for the message of this dream and the example of Daniel himself as he explains this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. With such humility and clarity, Daniel speaks what God has revealed to him. And he speaks it to a mighty king who very clearly has intentions to do away with all these people that are part of the wise men. Daniel's life is on the line. But he speaks here with no hint of malice or ill will to the king, the very same king who destroyed his homeland and dragged off his people, himself included, into exile. But at the very same time, he says what is true. And it's terrifying and awesome truth. A truth that will affect Nebuchadnezzar himself and his kingdom. And that truth is that although the kingdoms of this world may glimmer like gold and silver, and although the kingdoms of this life may seem to be as sturdy as iron, there is no kingdom of this world that lasts. But there is one kingdom, everlasting. And though we may be a great many years removed from Daniel and from Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome, the rock that is God's kingdom is no less eternal today. And the kingdoms that make up our world are no less temporary. And for God to reveal his plan, a plan that even touches on the hope of salvation in Jesus, sets a seed For God to reveal this plan in this faraway place of Babylon, in the dream of a king who does not even believe in him, is just about as surprising as the way that God is going to go about fulfilling this plan and bringing the rock and establishing that everlasting kingdom. In the days of Rome, when Rome was supposedly king, and when their Caesar was called a son of God, and when they talked about his birth as gospel, good news, and when his project was called Pax Romana, peace of the world, by beating down our enemies, God entered that world, sent his true Son to bring a very different gospel. And it ended up destroying the kingdoms of the earth by loving his enemies and sacrificing himself. And as Colossians chapter 1 says, bringing peace by the blood of a cross, not the bloodshed of war, but his own blood on the cross. And this is what God had in mind long ago. God truly is the one who knows what lies in darkness. And he is the one, as Daniel prayed, who changes times and seasons, deposes kings, and raises up others. And for us, these truths continue to hold great significance, or they ought to. Especially if we really are trying to live as people who are in this world and yet not deep down of it. As we do, we need to remember that every kingdom in this life is temporary. Whether it's the ones that we call home or the ones that wage war halfway across the globe, temporary. And only God in his reign is eternal. Only God in his kingdom shall stand. And if we are a part of his church, like truly a part of his church, then we are built upon a rock that cannot be shaken. The hope of Jesus Christ. And wherever you go in this life, and whatever you may encounter in this world that is not really our true home, as you live as a citizen of God's kingdom, you can know that you're a part of the thing that truly lasts. And I think we can learn a lot from Daniel along the way too. When we face dark and difficult times in life, where will we turn? Will we rush to the source of truth? The one who knows what lies behind the darkness, and the one who has light dwelling in him. In our lives, when we live as though God is the source of our wisdom and we don't rely on our own wits and our own wisdom too much, we find that what the Proverbs say is true. When in all of our ways we acknowledge him, he can make our paths straight. I wonder if we could also learn this from Daniel. Could we even be like Daniel in being ready to speak a word on God's behalf? Ready to speak the truth that God reveals, which for us we're privileged to know through the Scriptures. Could we, like Daniel, be ready with great respect and great courage to point to a wisdom that's greater than our own? Wisdom and power that only God himself possesses. We have a lot to learn. I do. But one thing's for sure. When we commit ourselves to seeking God like Daniel did, when we seek his kingdom first and his righteousness like Jesus called us to do, the God who is able by his power to do everything we need is with us. And he's able to use us for his purposes. And one thing I love about Daniel is that he has the courage to speak what is true of God, even when it seems to be an unlikely audience, to change their hearts. And here with Nebuchadnezzar, at least for this time, he seems open to that. Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel after Daniel interpreted the dream. And he paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. And the king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." And maybe that's the last and best comparison to Joseph when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and now we have Daniel interpreting King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In both cases, you remember what was said. What Pharaoh and the others said of Joseph was, surely the Spirit of God is in this person. God's working through him. They looked at Joseph's life and they didn't dwell on Joseph himself because Joseph kept reflecting the glory to God. And we have this happening here too with Daniel. They look at what Daniel has done. Nebuchadnezzar sees not just Daniel, wise Daniel, but instead says, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. And there's really no greater compliment that can be given to a person of faith than for somebody to see your life, hear your voice, and say, surely your God is the Lord. That's what we're striving for. May God use us as he pleases. And may we strive always to live in a way that someone might see God reflected in our lives, because we're trying always to make him known and give him all the glory. Well, maybe this passage speaks to you in some way tonight. Maybe it's the example of Daniel that speaks to you, his courage, his humility, his willingness to depend upon God and seek him in those dark times in his life. His willingness to reflect God's glory so other people could see it. Maybe the part that touches your life tonight is the way that God, though many years earlier, had in mind to establish his kingdom forever. And he invites us to be a part of it. When we're baptized into Christ, it is as though we are transferred from the domain of darkness and into the marvelous light of God's kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And that's where he wants us to be. Maybe tonight that's where you need to be. However, tonight you may be called or challenged. Let's respond while we stand and sing.